European Union is really out of line. UK is out of line, but I'm sure I think that one can be worked out.
Well, that's pretty clear. The next place that is in line for Trump's next wave of import taxes as he seeks to get his way around the world is the European Union. Less clear what it means for the UK, though, because it sounds like the UK might be exempt. This is quite a tricky backdrop for British Prime Minister Keir Starmer heading to Brussels to start a new relationship with the EU. We'll discuss what it all means and what's been going on today in this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and sitting opposite me here in BBC Broadcasting House is our economics editor, Faisal Islam. Hello.
Hello.
I feel there's like big economics news kind of every hour now. Like we could meet up every hour and have plenty to talk about that had just happened in that preceding hour.
I'd love to say that this was a sign that things were good, but my presence is a leading indicator, perhaps, that bad news is around the corner.
And my stockbroking apps beg to agree. Right, also joining us from my old seat in the BBC Brussels bureau is Chris Mason. Hello, Chris.
Yeah, hello. It feels all topsy-turvy, me being here and you being there.
Well, it's a topsy-turvy world, as Faisal was just suggesting. So we are manifesting that today with our logistical arrangements. Right, okay, lots and lots of things to talk about. First of all, Chris, just explain why you're in Brussels and why the Prime Minister was there too. Just the basics.
Yes. So we're recording at 10 to 9 in the evening, Brussels time, 10 to 8 in the UK on Monday. Right now, the Prime Minister is just down the road from us at a posh palace in the middle of Brussels. For the first time since Brexit, a British Prime Minister joining EU leaders all gathered together. They're gathered together for this informal get-together with a particular focus on defence and Ukraine and Russia, but where on the way in this morning they inevitably were all asked about Donald Trump and tariffs after his remarks about the European Union. In summary, not very complimentary, and tariffs coming in the direction of this place and all of the member states. And then the Prime Minister this afternoon, before heading to the dinner, had been at NATO, the Defence Alliance, the headquarters of which is here in Brussels, meeting Mark Rutte, who was the Prime Minister of the Netherlands for years and years and years and took over as Secretary General of NATO a couple of months back, again with the focus, as you'd expect at an alliance like NATO, on defence and Ukraine and Russia. But again, not remotely surprisingly, the questions from us afterwards, from me and from ITV and from Sky, all about tariffs, particularly to the Prime Minister, as well as some questions about NATO, given we have the extraordinary spectacle at the moment of various NATO members taking public pot shots at each other about tariffs, and then also the public feuding between two NATO members about a bit of NATO territory, Denmark, the United States and Greenland. It's curious, isn't it, that, NATO's kind of founding central principle is that idea that an attack on one is an attack on all, and defending the kind of integrity of all of the members together. And, it wasn't really designed to have a situation where two members would be arguing over a bit of territory that belongs to one of them and another one would quite like.
Yeah, so let's focus on the trade war stuff rather than the actual war stuff and the sort of pretend, like, not really war between the UK and the EU of the last 10 years. Let's focus on the tariffs. So, Faisal, let's just go through them all then. So, over the weekend, we had Trump saying, I'm going to go ahead with my 25% tariffs, so taxing imports of goods and products from other countries. I'm slapping them on Canada and Mexico. Where have we got to them with that sort of first round of tariffs as we're recording just before 7 p.m. on Monday?
They were due to be put into place at midnight tomorrow, so in a few hours' time. There has been talks today between the US President and the Mexican President, Claudia Sheinbaum, and they have now been delayed for a month. And the Mexican president has agreed to send 10,000 troops up to the border to help secure it from illicit traffic of drugs and of people. So sort of something for everyone there. There was also a bit of a market reaction. It wasn't a crash. There was the general sense in the markets has been, this is never really going to happen. And then it does happen. And they're like, oh, it won't last very long. And on this occasion, certainly for the Mexicans, let's see what happens with the Canadians, it hasn't lasted that long, although it is a pause rather than a cancellation. And then in the backdrop, though, in other talks the US president has had today, he's obviously spread the net a little bit, rather hugely actually, for a new set of tariffs heading towards Europe. And then in the background, as I've been analysing, I guess one of these things is, why is he actually doing this? Is he doing it because of fentanyl? Is he doing it because of the trade deficit numbers? Is he doing it because he just wants to raise hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars of money?
And he's basically said all those three things at various different times.
And we're getting to the stage now where we should just start to, some of it, there's a certain humorous element to what he says, but actually we just need to take it quite seriously. So we need to take seriously that he's going to levy a universal tariff. And therefore, this whole, although I don't think the UK is in the first part of the queue, to coin a phrase, for the tariffs, the idea that we're going to be immune from the general trade impact, economic impact, well, that's for the birds. We're a very open economy.
Yeah.
But it's also clearly on the pathway, if there's universal tariff, to be affected by that.
So basically, where we've got to is then Mexico's got a pause on its tariffs because they're going to send these troops to the border, and we've just been hearing from Trump in the Oval Office, and he seems to think those troops might be there permanently, and therefore the tariffs might not apply ever. But if they're not there permanently, the tariffs will apply. There's going to be a call between Justin Trudeau, who's still Prime Minister of Canada for a bit longer, with Trump, probably actually just when we finish recording this podcast. But the mood music there doesn't sound like Canada is going to get the escape that Mexico's had. And then the reason everyone on the EU side woke up this morning and felt instantly quite ill was because on the way back from Mar-a-Lago on Sunday, chatting to our colleague actually, Nomi Iqbal, kind of on the tarmac in Washington, D.C., he said, next is the EU. But Chris, he then in the same sentence kind of went quite easy on the UK.
Yeah, he was kind of cryptic about the UK because he acknowledged that in his view there were some issues between the US and the UK as far as he sees the fairnesses or lack of it in terms of trade. But then yet again heaped praise on Keir Starmer, talked about the strength and warmth of their relationship. And so on the very day that the Prime Minister was turning up in Brussels to, in quite a moment in terms of the symbolism of it, crack on with this quote-unquote reset of relations between the UK and Brussels, expected to culminate in a summit in a handful of months' time in the spring. On the very day that he's coming out here to do that, he's confronted by this dilemma painted very starkly by the president. Now, this is a Brexit dividend in terms of the return of sovereignty. In other words, the capacity for the UK to take its own course. But from the Prime Minister's perspective, it presents him with this colossal dilemma. Do you side with the EU or do you side with the US? Now, he's holding to his public view that it isn't a case of either or. The thing is, whilst that might have been the case in the past under different presidents, we know what Donald Trump can be like, and we know what he thinks of Brexit. He's a big fan of it. We know what he thinks of the European Union. He's not a big fan of it. And so how does the Prime Minister pick a path through that dilemma when he wants a closer relationship with the EU, yes, on defence, but also on security and on crime, and crucially on trade as one of the levers to try and get the economy picking up a bit in the UK, whilst at the same time he's days, perhaps weeks away from a trip to the White House and a very delicate diplomatic relationship there, and I guess trying as much as he can to leave that relationship as warm as it apparently, superficially, outwardly appears to be right now, with him more willing, the president, to be warm about the UK than the rest of the EU. But is that still going to be the case if the quote-unquote reset trundles along? So it's really, really tricky for him.
And Faisal, are you saying that even if Keir Starmer does manage to pick that path, the UK is not immune because they get caught up in the economic global backwash of these tariffs that are applied, and you said the prospect of this universal tariff, in other words, Washington putting a tariff of, 10% on literally every item that comes in from abroad, to which the UK would not be immune.
Yes, there is that, but on this balancing act, which kind of now occurs against a much more volatile backdrop, this is really important judgment for the PM. You can see, I don't think he can do anything other than what he was saying today. We don't need to choose. We're going to go both ways. we're going to go or neither, one of the two. But he will have to choose one specific. There's the two areas where I think some choices will be required, that he will try to fudge for as long as possible. Firstly, it's on the degree with which we re-engage with food and farm exports. Mm-hmm. There's a spectrum from a very light deal, technically a New Zealand-style deal, to a Swiss deal, which is almost like being back in the single market for food and farm exports, to getting rid of almost all of the frictions. It's exactly the sort of thing that may have an impact on trade, especially for farmers. They've been a bit problematic for the government.
Well, it would just make it so much easier to sell cheese to France.
And fish, and those famous langoustines from the northeast, from the Brexit fishermen that sell them to French restaurants that found it very difficult, or loads of pages and pages worth of red tape. A lot of smaller businesses that just gave up in terms of trying to export. I know that the Chancellor has been quite, not surprised is not the wrong word, but it's quite stark, some of the representations she has had from the small business community on this issue, and wants to do something about it. And my instinct, as I've explained to you over the past month since the Chancellor went to Brussels, has been that I think they want to this reset is going to be harder than people realise. Now, if you go for the
harder, as in it's more ambitious. The stuff they ask for. Yeah.
Exactly. Now, if you go for this full fat veterinary deal, that is following the EU rulebook, that is following the European Court of Justice rules in this area, but the quid pro quo is you get free access in this area. Now, that is the precise kernel of the factor in the relationship between the UK and the EU that the US would take most interest in. And indeed, it would probably knock out the idea of a full US-UK trade deal, a free trade agreement. Now, I think the general view is that that's not going to happen anyway. And the US haven't pushed it. We haven't heard Donald Trump mention it. That the sorts of US food standards are not on the agenda, but no one's actually said that yet.
Yeah, just picking up on that comment a few minutes ago, Faz, you were talking about the prospect or lack of prospect of a US-UK free trade deal, and the trade-offs around a closer relationship on agricultural products with the EU. The other factor I think that really dampens down the likelihood, even if there was an appetite from the US side to really push ahead with it, would be the impact it would have on British agriculture, because there would be a demand that UK agricultural markets were opened up to the US, where stuff is done in a more kind of industrial style, if you like, as well as all of those old arguments about chlorinated chicken and all that stuff. It just, I don't think, would be politically sellable here, which does mean there's arguably greater scope in that trade-off to do something more closer with the EU, but with that domestic trade-off that you will reopen an argument that you already see the beginnings of now. You saw it with what Kemi Badenoch, the Conservative leader, has been saying over the last couple of days. She's been setting down various red lines that she thinks the government mustn't cross around that whole question about the extent to which you're unpicking Brexit. Now, the government might feel it can do that if given A, the size of its majority, and B, where it would appear, when you look at some of the opinion polls, suggests where public opinion might be now in terms of being willing to counter a closer relationship with the EU. But even when you box off some of those dilemmas and trade-offs in terms of the Washington-Brussels-London dynamic, there's then the domestic political dynamic.
And Chris, I know you've got to go because you're still in the middle of an incredibly busy day, but just with the old Brexit binder geek in me.
Yeah, I was looking around here to see if I could find any under the desk.
I mean, I think I did leave them there about 5 years ago. So if you find them, please give them a dust and then bring them back.
I wonder what that skip was doing outside.
Oh, no. I mean, just recycle them, whoever finds them. But how have we got any closer to actually anything being written down in paper? And I don't mean like a final UK-EU deal for their new relationship, but just what the UK is asking for or what the EU is prepared to offer. Because all I can think of is that the only thing in my mind that seems to exist on black and white is from ages ago when the EU said, this is what we, the EU, are offering when it comes to the mobility of young people doing jobs and education, either in the UK or the EU. There seems to be nothing else written down.
I don't think there is very much else written down that would fit neatly with a hole punch into one of your lever arch files. But here are the sort of rough tram tracks of it. So we know that this new EU Secretariat was set up in the Cabinet Office shortly after the election. A guy called Michael Ellam, who used to be in Downing Street under Gordon Brown, has been brought in as the senior civil servant to run it. He's seen to have plenty of clout within Whitehall because of his rank that he's been hired at in terms of pulling together the various strands of different government departments that have skin in this game. He's also out here in Brussels, I'm told, regularly doing the sort of official level negotiation. You've got the EU making an argument, as you say, around this idea of youth mobility. There are some in London who feel that just sounds remarkably like freedom of movement, even if it is quite narrowly demographically defined. And they also worry that because the EU is bigger than the UK, you'd have more people coming from the EU to the UK than vice versa. And that might be quite a hard sell, particularly in an era of sky-high legal migration numbers. You've got the ongoing conversation around agricultural products that we've talked about. Quite a lot of conversation about defence cooperation. That's seen as pretty low-hanging fruit. And then also data sharing as far as crime, international crime, cross-border crime is concerned. Could there be something on the mutual recognition of qualifications? Who knows? That might be seen here as sort of starting to chip away at single market stuff, and that accusation of cherry picking and all of that. So it's all of that sits broadly in the mix, and then it's down to the haggling and the trade-offs. And then, as Faisal was illustrating, really importantly, I think in all of these, there's then the extent to which in all of these you decide to pursue something that is relatively deep, but with that will come obligations, or something that is relatively thin, which will come with fewer of those, but then fewer of what proponents of them might see as benefits.
Chris, I'm going to let you go. Thank you very much, and safe travels back to the UK.
Talk to you soon. Au revoir.
Au revoir, yes. Faisal, anything else you want to just draw to our attention in this very chaotic international economic picture? I mean, I was just looking on the BBC News Live page, and Donald Trump's just been talking about setting up a new US sovereign wealth fund that could buy the American bit of TikTok so that he doesn't have to shut it down in a few weeks' time, based on the act of Congress that he's paused.
There's so many factors here that are going to have unintended consequences. So, for example, we haven't talked about China. On the one hand, the 10% tariff on China was quite modest. China hasn't retaliated. They've been through this before with Donald Trump. But the net result of a technicality is that packages that used to be sent directly from China or Canada or Mexico, it's called the de minimis rule, won't essentially be able to send out.
So if you send like a package that the contents of which is, I'm talking like an EU bureaucrat now, the contents of which is very low, like, I don't know, a pair of very cheap jeans from Shein or Temu, then it doesn't attract customs charges.
But now it will.
Right.
And that will alter the business model. We'll just put it like that. And what happens if some of those products don't face barriers elsewhere? They'll go where they're easiest to go. So, in fact, one Bank of England economist is suggesting the net result of all of these tariffs from America could be not to put up prices elsewhere, but to put them down elsewhere, like the UK. So it might be deflation in the UK. Or there's going to be a big issue for the business secretary to say, do we want all these goods that would have gone to America to come to the UK? These are the sorts of sort of unintended consequences that emerge. And I think you've also really got to think about how exactly this sort of develops in terms of global trade, the economy, trying to second guess what Donald Trump's going to do. Now, what the EU are quite good at is bureaucratically trying to work out how to fight these battles. As you know, they'll be thinking about how to exercise the most leverage. Could we envisage, as indeed a Canadian former minister suggested, that you would target the circle very closely around Donald Trump with tariffs?
In other words, put tariffs on his mates' products that they make.
On for example, on Elon Musk. That was a suggestion that came from the Canadians. So it could get quite tough quite quickly. And at that point, I think, again, the UK might have some choices.
Now, as promised, I've been speaking to our old friend Katya Adler because she has got a new documentary series out. It's on BBC Two on Monday night, and it's available now on iPlayer as well, where she's gone back to one of her old haunts, well, multiple haunts because they're multiple countries, because she's touring around the Balkans. And there's some fun stuff in there, but there's also some incredibly serious stuff about how geopolitics is playing out in those countries. And so she came on basically to flog that, but also we use it as an opportunity to get her take on all the things me and Chris and Faisal have just been talking about as well. And Katya's here. Hello.
Hello.
And in the week of our 5th birthday is a daily podcast as well. Because, you know, one of our eras we're doing is the Brexit cast era.
How could I not know?
Exactly. Where's your invitation? Right. Lots of things we could talk about from a kind of European perspective, not least your new documentary that's out. But first of all, I mean, this is our second go with Trump being president and thinking about it from an EU perspective, isn't it? Is there stuff that you remember from the last time that is kind of quite lodged in your mind this time around?
So I think they take him, and I think this is across board, this isn't just the EU, is it? They take him a lot more seriously this time. They take his threats more seriously. And they take the people around him more seriously in that, you know, you used to hear that very patronising phrase, didn't you? Oh, well, the adults are in the room, they'll control him like he was some kind of toddler in a playpen. Well, this time, you know, the playpen is open. And the people around him had to sign up. You know, basically, if you wanted to be involved in trade in the Trump administration 2.0, you had to say, I love tariffs as much as you. And, you know, he says it's his favourite word in the dictionary. And some of this actually, Adam, reminds me a little bit before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Do you remember how many analysts and politicians said he's not really going to do it? I mean, I know he's got Russian soldiers surrounding Ukraine on most sides, but he's not going to do it. He did it. And I think we're in the era of he did it. And then you have the EU, which is always so slow and cumbersome, and things are happening really, really fast. So the EU says they're ready for tariffs, and of course, they were watching from the sidelines, so they have been preparing for quite a long time. So they do have lots of options, but they're scared. They're nervous, for sure.
I just always remember last time round with US tariffs on steel and aluminium, going to a briefing at the European Commission with all the trade people there, and like all the kind of the bureaucrats would come out and speak to us and show us their spreadsheets and their charts.
So you love all the
yeah, because I went to them.
Yeah.
It was like 5 p.m. on a Friday. Everyone else had gone home. And I remember them saying, oh, we've got 2 lists. The first list will come in 6 months, and the second list of our tariffs will come in maybe in 18 months' time after we've consulted with the World Trade Organization, because we want to do this by the book. And so actually their tactics are a lot more slow moving than Trump's tactics.
They are, but they do know. So, you know, the EU always says, oh, we want to be a big player on the world stage. Well, they're not. But where they are a big player on the world stage is when it comes to trade. They are a big economic force. Yes, we talk about how France is stumbling and Germany is stumbling, but this is a big block of a lot of people and it is an economic force. And we've seen that, yes, Trump made those mega tariffs on Canada and on Mexico, but those are 2 countries that are weaker. But with China, he was more careful this time round so far. And also with the EU, he's threatened, but he hasn't done yet. That doesn't mean he's not going to. He says he will, so we assume that he will. But the EU knows that he's hesitating slightly. So I think what's interesting here from the EU perspective is, obviously, when it comes to trade, that's the Commission. But there are 27 countries behind the Commission in this. And what you heard from the French today is, we actually have to stick together. Why? Because they're not speaking with one voice. You have the French on the one hand who say we're going to be very hardline, but on the other hand, you have President Macron who says, President Trump, come over and let me invite you to some really glamorous event in Paris. A bit like we do. We know he likes Scotland. We know he likes the royal family. We can use that sort of, appealing to his ego side of things. Then you have the president of the European Central Bank, Christine Lagarde. She says, time for checkbook diplomacy. We need to buy agricultural products that we can under EU rules, from the United States. We need to be willing. We need to, whatever it is, military equipment. Let's get our checkbooks out. Then there are concerns. Giorgia Meloni of Italy, the Prime Minister, really matey with Donald Trump. Really, really matey with Elon Musk. Will she be tempted to ally herself closer to them than with the rest of her EU partners and split off? So these are the kind of considerations that are going on, behind the scenes. They are rolling up their sleeves, but yes, of course they're concerned.
And talking of our favourite thing, negotiations, what do you make of Keir Starmer's visit to Brussels today?
The reset. Over dinner. Theresa May didn't get dinner. So he's got dinner. Before that, he was at NATO, which is very key because today really is about security and defence. So that dovetailed nicely to be with the EU member states. In a way, security and defence, when you're looking for a reset, is low-hanging fruit. Everybody wants it.
Everyone's in favour of security.
Everyone's in favour of security. And in the world that we live in, everybody's in favour of defence. The UK has a lot to offer, and the EU can offer things to the UK as well. So, I mean, the devil, as we always say, is in the details, because the UK is what the EU calls now a third country. So if they're looking at joint procurement, contracts for military hardware or something, they'll have to get the wording and the legalising right. But this is something they should be able to get going quite easily. What I wonder, though, is as they talk today about the big picture, the fact that you can't just rely on the United States, as, Europe has tended to do since the Second World War, because Trump is so unpredictable. There's China, there's Russia. This isn't the West anymore. This is a multipolar world. Will that big vision and fear that they focus on today when they talk about defence, will that help them get over the difficulties and the detail when it comes to other things the UK wants, like trade, like getting rid of red tape? Keir Starmer has clear red lines. The EU has theirs as well. But will there be more flexibility because of this bigger picture?
And not to be a process geek, again, for my 13th year in a row, but where have we got with what the EU is actually going to offer and what it will be packaged up with? So, for example, will they do a deal on security, which they want to do, but they will have to do the deal with security alongside fisheries and EU students coming to the UK? Will there be a big package, or can it be done bit by bit?
So this depends who you speak to, because you won't be surprised when I tell you the French are being difficult, as they can be sometimes. But don't forget, we have politics. So Keir Starmer, from some members, so the Liberal Democrats say he's being too timid and this is just tinkering around the edges, what he's asking for the EU.
Customs union.
And what you have from Nigel Farage, for example, is saying, this is a betrayal, or you're going to try and get the EU through the back door. We had that from Lord Frost, who used to be the main UK negotiator when it came to Brexit. So we have our politics that he has to be mindful. They have theirs. So France, very possibly, is going to head to a new parliamentary election this summer. Fisheries, well, that tends to be, those areas in France tend to be dominated by Marine Le Pen and her political friends. So that is something that the French government is going to be mindful of. And so the French are saying, no fish, no nothing else. But again, that's where I come back to this big picture, because everyone else is kind of annoyed about the fish question, just like they'd be annoyed with the UK if they don't bend a bit over the fish question, because the basic thing that the French want is to just extend what they've got already.
Yeah.
Yes, they'd like more, but they want to extend. So can the UK also say, sure, let's do a deal on fish, and now let's talk about the other grown-up stuff in the room?
Again, to focus on the process, though, I just think back in the old days of Brexit, they had Article 50, like the departure process for the 27 to focus on, and that was how they could get all their ducks in a row, because there was a big thing to kind of aim for. This time there isn't a big thing for them to aim for.
There's no big...
how do you actually corral the 27 to make them all just right, we've decided this is what we're going to do?
Because they're going to give the Commission a mandate.
Right.
And this is your process that we're looking at here. So when it comes to security and defence, we're looking at some kind of agreement that's not legally binding, which will have all sorts of details. And the aim is to get that done by an EU-UK summit. They're already in working groups about this sort of thing. So can that be done by April, May, possibly June, when this summit is? What else we're going to get at the summit is talk about the other list of wishes that the UK has, and the EU has some of its wishes of its own. And then you've got the member states who have to give the European Commission a mandate, just like they did with Brexit. And then they get their ducks in a row. What might be difficult for the UK is what we saw when it came to Brexit is, yes, you have some countries which are more Anglophile, some countries that worry more about the goods that they might lose or red tape or blah, 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 blah. But if they all have to agree, they tend to get a bit more hard line because that's the only way to get together. This could happen. The other thing is that the EU thinks we've got an agreement. We've got the TCA. We've got that post-Brexit agreement. We don't have the cliff edge. Remember, we used to talk about the no-deal cliff edge, which the EU said it didn't care about, but it did. But now there is no cliff edge. And so I think they want to do a deal, but it could drag on because there is no cliff edge. And that's where I come back again to geopolitics, will that focus minds? Because the EU and UK, since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, they do realise a lot of their values do align. But of course, you do wonder with Keir Starmer today thinking, how quickly and how deep do I want this reset to be? Never mind my domestic political problems, but if Donald Trump gets cross with me as a result and ends up imposing...
Yeah, because it looks like cozying up as opposed to acting in your economic self-interest.
Well, also, and one of the main things that was actually in the Labour manifesto was, the veterinary agreement, as we call it, just because it's an easy way to talk about it, basically getting rid of a lot of the red tape with sort of food exports and imports. If you do that, it means signing up to EU rules forever, basically. As they change theirs on food, you change yours. Well, that will limit a deal that we can do on agricultural produce with the United States. So it does have a knock-on effect. However, if and when we get it, I think the UK can just say, well, you told us that we couldn't have our cake and eat it and we couldn't cherry pick. Well, we've just done it, because that is exactly what that's about. This is taking part of the single market and saying we want a deal on that particular area only.
Now, I had a very enjoyable afternoon watching episode 1 of your new documentary series.
You actually watched?
I actually did it all the way through. Yes. I mean, because it ends with you going whitewater rafting. Although it's not quite whitewater, it's just quite a fast-flowing river, isn't it?
Whitefish.
So you're going back to one of your old stomping grounds, which is the Balkans. I mean, you were there when that was a dark place going through a dark time.
Really,
originally,
really dark. 30 years ago, but I was working in Vienna for Blue Danube Radio, the English language radio station. Originally in children's programs, wanting to get into news, and we're talking about the 90s here, when Yugoslavia, one country, started breaking up and ended up in many. And whereas I think we have discovered a lot of the Balkans for our holidays now, Croatia, Albania, I mean, gorgeous, right? In those, then it was more the Austrians, the Germans who knew it very well, who liked to go sailing there. And so a lot of the refugees were coming that way. And so I got to know a lot of people who were suffering in the wars. I got to hear lots of terrible stories. And Kosovo, and cover it for the news. And Kosovo was the first war that I covered in person. And it made a huge impact on me as a young journalist. Also because I met a lot of Kosovar Albanian women who had been raped by Serb soldiers as a tool of war. And it's one thing to read about something, isn't it, Adam? And then when you actually meet people and they tell you about their experiences. And it's always stayed with me. And I've always wanted to go back to the Balkans. And partly also because I love all this big picture stuff. And as we're talking about power and who's in our corner, and now we're in a multipolar world, we talk about Russia and China, but we often forget the corner of our own continent, which is the southeast, which are the Balkan countries. And whereas the West was really involved in ending the wars in former Yugoslavia, so much so that in Kosovo, because Tony Blair was so involved in the NATO bombing that ended the war there. You still have Tony Blair Street. Children are still called Tony Blair, Tonibler. And so, they're very much tied to the UK. But, in other ways, everything has kind of moved off. The West kind of turned away. And in the meantime, China, Russia are there. They are in the Balkans. Half of China's investment in Europe, reportedly, I can't do all the numbers and prove it to you myself, is in the Balkans. It's called China's gateway to Europe with soft power. Russia, in Serbia, ethnic Serbs, many of them, their allegiance is to Russia, not the West, even though, they're in the line to join the European Union. It is fascinating and beautiful and perplexing. And, and the joy of a documentary like this is it's part travel, part history, part current affairs, and an opportunity to laugh at me while I go whitewater rafting badly, for example.
And also the trail for episode 2 is you hanging out the back of like an Air Force tanker plane.
I loved it.
Tell me, set the scene.
I loved it, because that's the thing. We say 30 years. So, I've been around the block a few times, few wars, few stuff, and then you think, and then you do something else where you just think, oh my God, that was amazing. I've never done that before. So basically, Romania is an EU member state. It's a member state of NATO, but often has felt a bit treated like a second-class citizen. Since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the West goes, oh, Romania, actually, you're in a very geostrategic position, a neighbour of Ukraine on the Black Sea with Russia. So NATO's building its biggest defence base in Europe in Romania. So I said, oh, we have to demonstrate this. You have to go up with something. So I went up in a cargo plane that was doing air policing exercises, and the RAF was helping train Romanian pilots. So basically, I went up in the cargo plane, and you had to sort of cleat yourself into the floor with a harness. That's it. And then they open the back of the plane. You put your legs out the side, and these RAF jets, and the Finns were there as well, were coming right up to, I could see the pilots' faces as they were sort of all spinning around and stuff like that. And
did you see the pilots going, oh my God, it's Katya Adler from Brexitcast?
That's right. Adam's friends, they said. That's Adam's friends. And I waved and promised to get your autograph. But yeah, it was amazing. And Romania also, I mean, King Charles has got B&Bs there that you can rent.
His side hustle, yeah. So how many episodes is it? So as I said, I've only seen episode 1 and seen the trailer for episode 2.
Yeah, so it's 2 episodes.
2 episodes.
A bit like we did Putin, living next door to Putin. So this is in a similar vein. And it's called Europe's Forgotten Frontier because it is forgotten in so many ways. Not all tourists are alive to the fact that it's an amazing place to go. Also for mini breaks, for weekends, Sarajevo is fantastic. But also forgotten geopolitically in many ways.
Well, yeah, and I just think back to our Brexit days. I would go to like the Western Balkans summit, but not to find out what was happening in the Western Balkans, but to doorstep Donald Tusk about what he thought about Theresa May's latest letter. So yeah, even it was forgotten even by me when I was there.
Yeah. So it's time not to forget it, because you have all of these other influences there. Think about Kosovo, for example. After the war, when the West turned away, there were donations that came in from all over the Islamic world, lots of mosque building, which is great for people there, and they were very grateful for the money and the support. But there were some extremist imams that came in as well on the back of that, and Kosovo per capita sent more fighters to Islamic State group than any other European country. So that's something they're having to fight against. So as I say, there are all these different influences in this small region, and yeah, I mean bears. Lots of bears in Romania as well. So it's one of those privileges where I feel very lucky to do the job that I do, to do something like that.
Yeah.
And it's hopefully making us realise how rich and interesting this forgotten frontier is.
And great to catch up.
It was so nice. It's always lovely to see you.